They say heartbreak is the kind of wound that leaves no scar on the skin but burns forever in the soul. And for Daniel, that wound opened on a rainy night when the woman he had once promised to share his life with decided that poverty was too heavy a burden to carry. He was not a man without dreams, nor without effort, but at that moment in his life, his pockets were empty, his hands calloused from work that never seemed to bring enough, and his heart still full of hope that love was stronger than money. Yet, as the rain struck against the tin roof of their small apartment, she packed her bags, her face colder than the storm outside, and told him she deserved more than what he could ever give. He begged her to stay, not for his pride, but because he truly believed their love had been real. But she did not even look back when she stepped out the door. That night, Daniel learned what it meant to be abandoned not just by a wife, but by the dream of a family he thought would last forever. The days that followed were gray and merciless. He worked in odd jobs, fixing broken machinery, unloading trucks, cleaning offices late at night. Each dollar earned felt like a drop of water falling into an endless desert. His heart carried the weight of betrayal, and in the silence of his small rented room, he replayed her last words again and again. Words that told him he was not enough, that love could not survive without wealth. Those words did not just break him. They carved themselves into his memory as a challenge. Because deep inside, Daniel knew he was not defined by the emptiness of his pockets but by the strength of his will. He refused to believe that poverty was his destiny. Every morning before the city awoke, he would rise, look at his reflection in a cracked mirror, and whisper to himself, "One day, I will build something that cannot be taken away." He had no plan yet, only the raw determination of a man who had been pushed to the ground and had no choice but to stand again. His neighbors saw him as just another poor man trying to survive, but behind his tired eyes, a fire had been lit. A fire born not of revenge, but of the need to prove to himself more than to anyone else that he was capable of transforming his story. It was in those years of struggle that he discovered a gift he had always carried within him: the ability to see opportunities where others saw only problems. While unloading boxes in a warehouse, he noticed how poorly managed the supply was, how waste and disorder cost the owners thousands. He began suggesting small changes, speaking with quiet confidence, and soon managers started listening. His ideas saved money, improved efficiency, and though he was still paid little, he realized that his mind, not his muscles, would be the key to his future. On sleepless nights, he would stay awake studying borrowed books on business, management, and economics. He could barely afford the candlelight to read, yet he devoured every page as if it were a map leading him out of his misery. And slowly, step by step, the vision of his future began to take shape. He no longer dreamed of simply surviving. He dreamed of building something great, something that would not only lift him from poverty but also inspire others who, like him, had been told they were not enough. But behind every dream, there is still the shadow of pain. When he walked past the places where he and his wife once strolled, laughter echoing in happier days, he felt the sting of memory. Sometimes he wondered where she was, if she was truly happier in her new life, surrounded by wealth bought through someone else's effort. Yet, instead of bitterness, those thoughts only pushed him forward. If she had left because he was poor, then he would prove to himself that he could rise without her. Not to win her back, not to show her she had been wrong, but because he refused to let her abandonment define the rest of his life. One evening, after months of long days and endless nights, he stood on a hill overlooking the city. Lights flickered across the skyline, and in them, he saw not just buildings and streets but possibilities. He clenched his fists, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. "I will build my own path," he whispered into the night. That vow became his compass, guiding him toward a future still unseen but already alive in his heart. What Daniel did not yet know was that destiny had a way of weaving surprises into the fabric of our struggles. His journey would not only lead him to success beyond his imagination but also to a kind of love purer than any he had known before, a love that would not measure his worth by the weight of his wallet, but by the depth of his soul. And that love, still hidden from him, waited quietly in the humblest of places, where he would least expect to find it. Success is never born overnight. It is carved slowly, with hands that refuse to let go of the dream even when the body trembles with exhaustion. For Daniel, the road forward was long, unpaved, and full of obstacles. Yet his hunger for change burned brighter than the darkness around him. He started with nothing more than a notebook filled with ideas, a few borrowed coins, and a determination that could not be broken. Every small opportunity became a stepping stone. At first, he bought and resold small tools to workers in the warehouse, not for profit alone but because he had noticed how hard it was for them to get supplies when they needed them. He solved problems people had stopped noticing. Where others saw chaos, Daniel saw patterns, and where others saw failure, he saw openings. It was during this time that he learned his greatest lesson: that true wealth was not only measured in money but in the ability to create value for others. He began helping workers track their deliveries, organizing ledgers in ways that made sense even to those who could barely read. Soon, his name was whispered as the young man who could fix problems, who could find order in the storm. And though he was still poor, still wearing worn-out shoes with holes in the soles, he carried himself like a man who had already glimpsed a brighter tomorrow. One evening, while delivering a small batch of goods to a factory owner, Daniel found himself invited into an office for the very first time. The air smelled of tobacco and polished wood, the walls lined with books and maps. The owner, impressed by Daniel's sharpness, asked him to explain how he kept track of shipments so effectively. Daniel spoke clearly, not with arrogance but with confidence born from experience. By the time he finished, the man leaned back in his chair, tapped his cigar, and said words Daniel would never forget. "You think like an owner, not a worker." Those words ignited a new fire within him. For the first time, someone had seen in him what he had always whispered to himself in the silence of his rented room: that he was meant to build, to lead, to create something larger than himself. From that day on, Daniel was no longer content with small trades. He set his eyes on something greater. He began saving every coin, eating little, sleeping less, and investing in knowledge. He purchased used business books from street vendors, copied ledgers by hand to practice, and sought out conversations with anyone who could teach him about management, finance, or trade. And though loneliness often pressed heavily against him, he held onto the belief that one day, his sacrifices would bear fruit. Months turned into years, and slowly, the seeds he planted began to grow. Daniel started his first small company managing supplies for local businesses. It was nothing more than a cramped office with a second-hand desk and a flickering lamp, but to him it was a kingdom. Each contract he secured, each handshake he earned, was proof that he was walking toward the destiny he had once promised himself. But success did not come without enemies. Competitors laughed at him, calling him the poor man's dreamer. Some tried to sabotage his contracts, spreading rumors that he was unreliable. Yet, Daniel never retaliated with anger. Instead, he let his work speak for him. Every failure became a lesson, every betrayal a test of resilience. And slowly, one by one, the voices of doubt grew quieter as his results grew louder. There were nights when he would return to his small apartment, still sparsely furnished, and sit in the dark remembering the woman who had left him. He wondered if she had ever thought of him, if she would be surprised to know that the man she abandoned was now building something real. But rather than bitterness, those thoughts only fueled him further. She left because I was poor, he thought. One day I will prove to myself, not to her, that I was always more than enough. Years later, Daniel walked into a bank not as a beggar seeking a loan, but as a businessman with contracts and results that could not be ignored. He secured his first major funding, and with it, expanded his company beyond his wildest imagination. Offices were opened in multiple districts, workers hired by the dozens, and his name began to appear in local newspapers as the man who had risen from nothing to build a growing empire. Yet, amidst all the glory, Daniel remained humble. He never forgot the hunger in his belly, the cold nights, the humiliation of being left behind. When he saw a worker struggling, he remembered himself. He paid his employees fairly, sometimes even generously, because he knew the weight of every coin in the pocket of a poor man. It was during this rise that he met her, the secretary who would one day change his life. Her name was Anna, a young woman with quiet eyes and a gentle spirit. She was not dressed in luxury, nor did she seek attention. She worked with diligence, often arriving early and leaving late, carrying herself with humility and grace. Daniel noticed her not for her beauty, though she was beautiful in her simplicity, but for the way she treated everyone with respect, from the janitor to the manager. At first, she was simply another employee, her presence in his growing empire almost invisible. But soon, small moments caught his attention. The way she stayed calm when problems arose, the way she smiled softly when others were harsh, the way she seemed content with so little yet gave so much of herself. Something in her reminded him of the life he had once lived, the humility he had never let go of, and the quiet strength that had carried him through his darkest nights. Daniel did not yet know it, but the story of his life was about to shift once again. For while he had built an empire with his hands and his mind, his heart had remained cautious, locked behind the memory of betrayal. And Anna, with her humble ways, would become the key to unlocking it. Because sometimes the greatest treasures come not in the form of gold or success, but in the quiet presence of someone who sees your worth not for what you own, but for who you are. He had transformed his company into a household name, and his story was often cited in business magazines as a testament to resilience and vision. Yet, whenever the world praised him, he quietly reminded himself of the days when he was poor, broken, and dismissed. That humility kept him grounded, but it also carved a loneliness inside him. The women who now sought his company often did so with ulterior motives, drawn to his power and wealth, not his heart. He longed for something real, something untainted by status or appearances. It was during this time of silent yearning that Anna entered his life. She was a new secretary, hired after a round of interviews he had barely paid attention to, leaving the final decision to his human resources team. On her first day, she arrived quietly, dressed modestly, her hair pulled back, her eyes shy but steady. There was nothing flamboyant about her presence, but something about her authenticity struck him immediately. She carried herself with humility, and yet there was strength in her silence, a quiet dignity that reminded him of who he once was. Unlike others in the office, she never fawned over him, never sought his attention. Instead, she did her work diligently, arriving early, leaving late, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. When he thanked her for a job well done, she would smile gently and nod, as if gratitude was enough reward. The simplicity of her response disarmed him. One late evening, as he was leaving the office after a long day, he noticed Anna still at her desk, sorting through files with tired eyes. "Anna, it's late. You should go home," he said, pausing at her door. She looked up, startled. "I just wanted to finish this so tomorrow won't be overwhelming," she replied softly. He hesitated, then walked closer. "You remind me of myself years ago," he admitted, his voice carrying a weight of memory. "Always staying late, always working harder than anyone else, just to prove I belonged." She tilted her head slightly, curious but respectful. "And did it work?" she asked. A faint smile curved his lips. "Eventually, but it came with its own battles." There was a pause, a silence filled with understanding rather than awkwardness. It was in that moment that he realized she wasn't intimidated by him. She saw him not as the powerful CEO, but as a man who had once been broken and had rebuilt himself piece by piece. In the weeks that followed, he found excuses to linger near her desk, to ask her questions that had nothing to do with work. He learned that Anna had grown up in a small town, raised by a single mother who struggled to make ends meet. She had come to the city not for glory, but for survival, determined to support her younger siblings through school. Her humility wasn't an act. It was her essence. The more he listened, the more he felt something stirring within him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Anna wasn't dazzled by his wealth. In fact, she rarely spoke about money or status. She talked about family, resilience, kindness, and the importance of staying true to oneself. She reminded him of values he had nearly forgotten amid the noise of success. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he invited her to join him for a simple dinner at a small diner he used to frequent back when he had nothing. She hesitated at first, unsure if it was appropriate, but eventually agreed. Sitting across from her in that modest booth, with the hum of the neon sign outside and the aroma of fried food in the air, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Anna laughed easily, her eyes lighting up when she spoke about her siblings, her dreams for their future, and the little joys that made her days bearable. He watched her, captivated not by beauty alone but by the purity of her spirit. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply being herself, and that, more than anything, drew him closer. It was then that he realized the greatest irony of his life. The woman who had once left him because he had nothing had forced him onto a path that eventually gave him everything. And yet, here he was, finally discovering that true love wasn't built on wealth or appearances, but on humility, respect, and shared humanity. But the story was only beginning. As his feelings for Anna grew, so did the shadows of his past. His ex-wife had recently reappeared in the city, and whispers reached his ears that she was aware of his success. The thought of her return brought a storm of emotions: anger, hurt, and a lingering fear that the scars she left behind were not fully healed. And in the midst of that storm, he faced a choice: to remain guarded, protecting his heart behind the walls he had built, or to take a risk with Anna, trusting that this time love might not abandon him. It was a choice that would define not only his future but also the man he had become. The days that followed blurred into one another, a mix of board meetings, phone calls, and business trips that could have easily consumed him. Yet, amidst the chaos, he found himself looking forward to the moments when Anna was near. A simple good morning from her, a cup of coffee she placed on his desk without a word, or the way her presence brought calm to his office. All of it became a quiet anchor in his busy world. He began to notice small details: the way her hands trembled slightly when she held a pen, as though she was always pushing past nervousness to appear strong; the way her eyes softened whenever she spoke about her siblings, carrying a tenderness that no hardship could erase; and the way she never complained, even when work weighed heavily on her shoulders. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the tall glass windows of his office, he found her standing near the window, watching the storm with a distant expression. He approached quietly. "You look like you're somewhere else," he said gently. She turned, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," he interrupted softly. "Sometimes the rain makes us remember things we'd rather forget." Her lips curved into a sad smile. "It reminds me of home. Our roof leaked whenever it rained, and my mother used to gather pots and pans to catch the drops. We would laugh about it, even though we knew it meant another repair we couldn't afford." He was silent for a moment, then said, "You make it sound almost beautiful." "It was," she replied simply, "because we had each other. Even when life was hard, love made it lighter." Her words struck something deep within him, echoing in the hollow spaces where pain had once lived. He envied her ability to find beauty in hardship, to hold on to love even when it seemed the world offered little else. The more he listened to her, the more he realized that Anna had something his wealth could never buy: a soul unbroken by struggle. And slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, a bond began to grow. But with closeness came risk. Whispers began to spread in the office. Some employees noticed the way he lingered near her desk, the way his eyes softened when he spoke to her. They began to gossip, their words sharp and envious. "She's just a secretary," one voice sneered behind closed doors. "What could he possibly see in her?" Another muttered, "She's playing her cards, right? Wait until she gets her hands on his fortune." The rumors didn't reach Anna at first, but he heard them. They reminded him too much of the cruelty he had endured in his younger years, the mocking voices that told him he wasn't enough. He wanted to shield her from that, to protect her dignity. Yet, protection wasn't always possible. One evening, Anna hesitated before leaving the office, her face pale and her eyes clouded with something unspoken. He noticed immediately. "Anna, what's wrong?" he asked, concern threading his voice. She bit her lip, hesitating. "It's nothing, just silly words from people who don't matter." "Tell me," he insisted gently. She looked at him then, her voice soft but steady. "They think I'm here for the wrong reasons, that I'm using you." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. He clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. Not at her, but at the injustice of it. "Do you believe them?" he asked carefully. Her eyes widened in surprise. "No, I know who I am. I don't need to prove that to anyone." Relief washed over him, mingled with admiration. She was stronger than he realized. Where once he had let cruel words tear him apart, Anna stood firm, anchored by her own truth. That night, as he lay awake in his grand but lonely penthouse, he thought about everything he had endured: poverty, heartbreak, humiliation, and how those scars still whispered to him in the dark. And yet, here was Anna, walking into his life like a quiet light, unafraid of storms, unshaken by shadows. It was then he understood. He was falling in love with her. But just as the realization bloomed in his heart, the past returned to test him. A message arrived the next morning from an unfamiliar number. It was short, almost careless, but it struck him like a blade. "Hello, old friend. It's been a long time. Let's meet." The name beneath the words froze him in place. His ex-wife. The woman who had once vowed to love him, only to abandon him in his darkest days, had found her way back into his life. He could almost hear her voice again, sharp with contempt, echoing the moment she left. "I didn't marry you to be poor forever." Now she was reaching out, and he couldn't shake the suspicion that it wasn't love that brought her back, but the gleam of the empire he had built with the very hands she once dismissed. As he stared at the message, a storm began to brew inside him. How could he face her again? And worse, what if her sudden reappearance threatened the fragile bond he had begun to build with Anna? The message burned in his mind long after he put his phone away. For hours, he tried to bury himself in work, but every decision, every conversation, every document in front of him blurred under the weight of her name. His chest felt tight, as though the past itself was clawing its way back, refusing to let him breathe freely. When he finally gave in and agreed to meet her, he told himself it was only to find closure, only to face what had once broken him and prove to himself that he was no longer the man she had left behind. Yet, beneath that thin armor of self-assurance, fear lingered, fear that she might still hold some invisible chain over him, that her words could still cut as deeply as they once had. They met at a lavish restaurant in the city, one she had chosen. He arrived early, his posture rigid, his mind rehearsing what he would say. He wasn't here to rekindle old ties, he reminded himself. He was here to face her like the man he had become, not the boy she abandoned. When she walked in, it was as though time bent in cruel irony. She was dressed in elegance, her hair shining, her lips painted with the same bold confidence he remembered. But her eyes, those eyes once filled with warmth, were now sharp, scanning the room like a predator seeking its prey. "Look at you," she said as she approached, her voice laced with false sweetness. "You've changed. Wealth suits you." He stood to greet her, his expression carefully neutral. "And you haven't changed at all," he replied, though the words carried a weight she didn't seem to notice. They sat, and the conversation began like a dance of shadows. She asked about his company, his success, his penthouse overlooking the city. Every question was dipped in curiosity, yet beneath it he could hear the hunger, the desire for the life she had walked away from, now polished and gleaming in his hands. At one point, she leaned in, her smile practiced. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "Leaving you was the worst decision of my life. But maybe it's not too late. We could start again. After all, we know each other better than anyone else." Her words might have once shattered him, filling him with desperate hope. But now, as he looked into her eyes, all he felt was clarity. She wasn't here because she loved him. She was here because of his success, because the boy she had once dismissed had become the man she could no longer ignore. Before he could respond, though, a voice called his name. He turned, and his heart lurched. Anna stood near the entrance of the restaurant, holding a folder in her hands. She had been sent to deliver urgent documents for him, unaware of what she was walking into. The moment their eyes met, he saw confusion flicker across her face, followed by something deeper, hurt. She glanced at the woman sitting across from him, elegantly dressed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The scene painted a picture that words could not undo. Anna's lips pressed into a thin line, and without a word, she turned and left, the folder clutched tightly to her chest. He shot up from his seat, panic flooding him. "Anna!" he called, but the restaurant noise swallowed his voice. Behind him, his ex-wife laughed softly, a cruel edge to her tone. "Oh dear, I see things are more complicated than I thought. A secretary, is it? How predictable." Her words made his blood boil, but he didn't waste another second. He left her sitting there, her smirk following him out the door, as he rushed into the rain-soaked night in search of Anna. The city lights blurred in the downpour, and his shoes splashed against puddles as he ran. He didn't know where she had gone, only that he had to find her, had to explain before the fragile trust between them shattered completely. Every step echoed with fear, the fear of losing the one person who had begun to heal the wounds his ex-wife had left behind. The irony struck him like a cruel twist of fate. Just when he had started to open his heart again, the ghost of his past had appeared to rip it all apart. As the rain poured harder, he whispered to himself, almost like a vow, "I can't lose her, not like this." And with that, he pushed forward into the storm, determined to fight not just for his future, but for the love he had never thought he would deserve. The rain had already washed the streets clean by the time he returned to his penthouse that night, but nothing could wash away the hollow ache in his chest. Anna was gone. She had left the documents with the building concierge, her neat handwriting still visible on a sticky note that read simply, "For Mr. Carter." No warmth, no smile, no little encouraging doodle as she often left on files to brighten his day. Just distance, cold and unmistakable. He sat in his office, the city glittering through the glass wall behind him, but he felt more alone than he ever had in his life. He had known loss before, abandonment, humiliation, the crushing despair of poverty. But this was different. This wasn't just pain. This was fear that he had destroyed something precious before it had even truly begun. Over the next days, Anna became a ghost in his own company. She kept her distance, professional to the letter, her eyes avoiding his whenever they crossed paths. She no longer lingered to ask how he was doing, no longer teased him with lighthearted remarks when his stress showed. She was courteous, efficient, and utterly unreachable. And all the while, his ex-wife lingered at the edges of his world, weaving her way into business events and social circles. She appeared at galas where he was invited, always with the same charming smile and the same calculated words. "You belong with me," she whispered once when no one was listening. "You know it. We were always meant to have this life together." But he knew better. What she offered was not love, but a cage made of gold, and he refused to be trapped again. Yet how could he convince Anna of that, when the sight of him with his ex-wife had spoken louder than any denial he could offer? One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he went to her small apartment on the edge of the city. He had never been there before, respecting her privacy, but desperation had driven him to her doorstep. He knocked, heart pounding, rehearsing words of honesty and hope. The door opened slowly, and there she was, her hair loose, her expression guarded. Behind her, the modest space was cozy, filled with books and the faint scent of lavender. It was a world so different from his glittering penthouse, yet so much warmer. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her voice neither welcoming nor hostile, just tired. "I need to explain," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "What you saw, it wasn't what it looked like. She came back into my life, yes, but only to try and reclaim what she lost. I didn't invite her in, Anna. I didn't want her there. You have to believe me." Her eyes flickered with conflict, but she didn't step aside to let him in. Instead, she crossed her arms, holding herself tightly. "It's not about whether you wanted her there," she whispered. "It's about the fact that you sat with her, that you let her touch you, That for one moment, it looked like you belonged in her world. And she faltered, her voice cracking. I don't belong there. The words cut him deeper than any insult his ex-wife had ever thrown. No, he said quickly, stepping closer, desperate. Don't say that. You belong more than anyone. You belong because you're real, because you see me for who I am, not for what I own. Everything I've built, it feels empty without you in it. For a moment, her eyes softened, a flicker of the warmth he had come to crave. But then she shook her head, retreating a step. I can't, not now. I need time. And with that, she gently closed the door. He stood there in the dim hallway, his chest aching with the weight of what he was losing. But instead of despair, something else began to burn within him. Resolve. If he was to prove his love, it wouldn't be through words alone. It would be through actions that left no room for doubt. Actions that would show Anna and the world that his heart could never be bought, manipulated, or swayed by the ghost of the woman who had abandoned him. So he began to change the way he moved in his world. At the next gala where his ex-wife tried to corner him, he publicly and firmly rejected her advances, his voice calm but resolute. You don't belong in my future, he told her before the flashing cameras, ensuring there would be no more whispers, no more speculation. He poured his energy into his company, but with a different spirit. Projects focused on helping small businesses, on lifting others who once stood where he had. He appeared in interviews, not flaunting his wealth, but speaking of humility, resilience, and the unseen hands of kindness that had lifted him when he had nothing. And though Anna remained distant, he noticed her watching, her eyes softening little by little as she saw him live his truth. She saw the way he honored not just her, but every person who fought quietly against the odds. It wasn't a sudden reconciliation. It wasn't a dramatic embrace in the rain. It was slow, tender, and real. It was him proving, day after day, that love was not about power, not about wealth, but about trust, sacrifice, and the courage to open one's heart even after it had been broken. But just as the ice between them began to melt, the storm returned fiercer than ever. His ex-wife, furious at her rejection and the humiliation she suffered, prepared her final blow, a scheme that could ruin not only his reputation, but also everything he had worked so hard to build. And when the scandal hit, it would not be his wealth or his power that determined whether he survived. It would be the strength of his heart, and whether Anna would stand by his side when the world turned against him. The scandal broke like wildfire on a Monday morning, the kind of storm that spreads faster than truth can breathe. His face was splashed across tabloids and financial networks, headlines screaming accusations of fraud, corruption, and betrayal. The accusations were lies, fabricated documents, twisted narratives, carefully planted whispers, but they were poisonous all the same. Overnight, the empire he had built was painted not as a monument to perseverance, but as a house of cards built on deceit. And at the center of the storm was his ex-wife. She had orchestrated it all, using old contacts, fake witnesses, and carefully leaked stories to paint him as a man who had manipulated his way to wealth. She wanted him dragged down into the same pit of humiliation she had once shoved him into. She wanted to prove to the world and to herself that he wasn't worthy of the life she had walked away from. Inside his office, the atmosphere was suffocating. Employees whispered nervously in the hallways. Clients pulled their contracts. Partners demanded explanations. And through it all, he stood tall, refusing to let the fear in his chest reach his face. But behind closed doors, the weight nearly crushed him. He had fought his way up from nothing, brick by brick, scar by scar, only to see it all crumble because of one vindictive soul who couldn't stand to see him rise without her. The hardest blow of all came when he caught sight of Anna, her expression unreadable, holding a newspaper with his face staring back at her. She didn't confront him. She didn't accuse him. But the silence between them was heavier than any words could be. That night, alone in his penthouse, he stared out at the city skyline, the lights blurred by the tears he refused to shed. He thought of giving up, of walking away, of letting it all burn. After all, hadn't he built this empire to prove something, to her, to himself, to the world? And if the world wanted to strip it from him, what was left? But then he remembered Anna. He remembered her quiet laughter, her gentle encouragement, the way she believed in him when he doubted himself. He remembered the little notes she left on files, reminding him that life wasn't only about success, but about kindness, resilience, and love. And in that memory, he found his resolve. He wouldn't fight this battle with anger. He wouldn't sink to his ex-wife's level. He would fight it with truth, with integrity, with the same honesty that had carried him through poverty and heartbreak. The next day, he called a press conference. Cameras crowded the room, microphones angled toward him like weapons, waiting for his fall. His ex-wife sat smugly among the reporters, her eyes gleaming with triumph. But when he stepped up to the podium, he did not look defeated. He looked steady, calm, unshaken. "I was left once because I was poor," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "And now I am accused because I am successful. But money never defined me then, and it does not define me now. What defines me is the journey, the work, the failures, the nights I went hungry, the hands that helped me stand when I was too weak to stand on my own. Every brick in this company was built with sweat, honesty, and faith, and I will not let lies erase the truth of who I am." His words silenced the room. Even those who had come hoping for a spectacle leaned forward, captivated not by wealth or scandal, but by the raw humanity in his voice. When the conference ended, the damage wasn't undone. The rumors still swirled, the headlines still screamed, but something had shifted. The people had seen his heart, and hearts are harder to manipulate than numbers. As he left the building, Anna was waiting. She stood by the sidewalk, the evening sun painting her face in gold. Her eyes searched his, not for answers, but for truth. "Did you mean every word you said in there?" she asked softly. He stepped closer, his voice breaking with honesty. "Every single one, and more. I would give it all up tomorrow, the company, the wealth, the success, if it meant keeping the only thing that matters now. You." For a moment, she said nothing. But then, slowly, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that told him she believed. A smile that told him the storm might not take her from him after all. Yet as hope sparked between them, the ex-wife made her final move. That very night, she filed a lawsuit demanding a portion of his company, claiming she had supported him in the early years and therefore had a legal right to his fortune. It was a ruthless strike, and if she won, it could strip him of everything he had built. And as the battle shifted from public opinion to the cold, hard arena of the courtroom, he realized that the fight for his future, and for the woman he loved, was far from over. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Journalists filled the benches, cameras lined the hallway outside, and whispers ran like currents through the crowd. Everyone wanted to witness the downfall of the man who had risen from nothing. At the plaintiff's table, his ex-wife sat in a tailored suit, her smile polished and cold. She looked like a queen reclaiming her throne, confident that the system would bend to her will. To her, this was not about justice. It was about possession. It was about proving that no matter how far he climbed, she could still pull him down. At the defense table, he sat tall, his face calm though his heart pounded. Beside him were his attorneys, stacks of evidence neatly organized. But behind him, in the gallery, sat something far more important than any legal team. Anna. She had come, her presence quiet but steady, her gaze locked on him with faith that warmed his soul. The trial stretched for days. His ex-wife's lawyers painted elaborate stories of her supposed sacrifices, claiming she had supported him in the early years, funded his dreams, and was therefore entitled to a share of his empire. They presented forged documents, manipulated timelines, and endless rhetoric designed to twist the narrative in her favor. But when it was his turn to speak, he rose not just as a businessman, but as the man who had once been broken and rebuilt himself with nothing but will. He told the truth, not in polished sound bites, but in raw, unvarnished honesty. "I had nothing," he said to the judge, his voice firm. "When she left me, I had nothing but a broken heart and empty pockets. There was no support, no shared struggle. There was only abandonment. Everything I built came after she walked away, when I had no one to believe in me but myself. The only reason I stand here today is because I refused to let her cruelty define the rest of my life." He paused, glancing at Anna, who nodded through tears. "And let me be clear," he added, his voice steady. "What I value most now is not the company, not the money, not the status. It's the people who stood by me without asking for anything in return. People who showed kindness when they had no reason to. That is something no lawsuit can take away." The judge listened intently. The courtroom fell silent, as though the truth itself had drawn the air out of the room. In the end, justice prevailed. The ex-wife's claims crumbled under scrutiny, her lies unraveling until even her own lawyer faltered. The judge dismissed the case with sharp words about greed and deception. The gavel struck, and with it, years of pain and manipulation were finally put to rest. The ex-wife left the courtroom in disgrace. Her head held high, but her empire of illusions shattered. For the first time, he felt no anger toward her, only pity. She had gambled everything on wealth, and in the process, she had lost the only thing that could never be bought: love. When he stepped outside into the sunlight, the crowd erupted with questions, cameras flashing like lightning. But he ignored them all, walking straight toward Anna. She stood there waiting, her smile trembling with relief. "You fought with truth," she whispered when he reached her. "You didn't let the past break you this time." He took her hands in his voice breaking with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you. You reminded me that love is stronger than any lie, stronger than any empire." In that moment, surrounded by chaos and noise, he did the one thing he had been holding back since the day she walked into his office. He pulled her close and kissed her, not as a man desperate to prove himself, but as a man finally free. Months later, the company thrived stronger than ever, rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and purpose. He and Anna worked side by side, partners not just in business but in life. Her laughter filled the halls of his once lonely penthouse, turning it into a home. And then, on a quiet evening beneath the glow of city lights, he knelt before her with a ring. Not flashy, not extravagant, but simple and full of meaning. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice trembling not with fear, but with hope. Her answer was a tearful smile and a whispered, "Yes." Their wedding was not a spectacle for the elite, not a display of wealth. It was held in a garden filled with flowers and friends, laughter and light. And as they stood together, exchanging vows, he knew that this was the true measure of wealth. Not the skyscrapers, not the fortune, not the empire, but the heart that beat beside his. The boy who had once been abandoned for his poverty had become a man rich beyond measure. Not because of his company, but because of the love he had found in the most humble of places. And as he kissed his bride under the open sky, surrounded by those who loved them, the world seemed to whisper a single truth. Sometimes, the greatest revenge against cruelty is not hate or power, but happiness.